Marcus Hayes stood in the dirt parking lot of Riverside Lumber Mill with $420 in cash in the kind of desperation that makes rational men believe in miracles. The building complex sprawled before him like a dying giant, three massive structures of weathered timber and rusted corrugated metal, and every broken window reflected September clouds moving fast enough to remind him that autumn was coming and he had nowhere warm to take his daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His daughter Lily sat in their truck, 8 years old and silent in the way children become when they've watched their parents lose everything and learn that asking where they'll sleep only makes the worry lines deepen around their father's eyes. The county tax auction had lasted 16 minutes. Marcus had been the only bidder willing to take on a condemned lumber mill with structural failures, environmental violations, and a history of accidents that made liability insurance impossible to obtain. $420, the auctioneer had announced with the apologetic tone of someone selling a disaster disguised as opportunity, going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman who clearly hasn't consulted anyone with sense. Marcus had withdrawn his last $470 from the credit union that morning, kept $50 for gas and groceries, and bet the rest on a property that everyone in 5 counties knew was worthless and probably dangerous. His landlord had given him 2 weeks to vacate the trailer after the sawmill laid him off, said the lot was needed for someone who could actually pay the monthly rent. His applications to every logging operation and construction company within 100 miles had generated the kind of silence that felt heavier than rejection letters, and his ex-wife's attorney had sent another notice about child support arrears that Marcus kept in his glove box because reading it made his hands shake too badly to drive. The lumber mill had appeared in the legal notices between equipment auctions and foreclosure sales. County seizure for delinquent taxes, minimum bid $400, property conveyed as is with all structural defects, environmental liabilities, and historical baggage. Marcus had driven past it 4 times before gathering the nerve to walk the grounds, Lily doing math homework in the passenger seat while her father studied buildings that looked like they were held together by moss and memories. The structures had good bones, Marcus told himself, which was what desperate men said about buildings that had nothing else to recommend them. But the bones were real, timber frames from old-growth Douglas fir that didn't exist anymore, post and beam construction that had withstood 100 years of Oregon winters, and foundations made from stones pulled from the river that still ran behind the property. The roofs were failing in multiple places, the siding was rotted through, and the interiors were almost certainly death traps of rusted machinery and structural collapse waiting to happen. But it was land, 23 acres along the Willamette River, more property than Marcus had ever owned, and with enough work it might become something that generated income, storage facilities maybe, or workshops, anything that wasn't sleeping in their truck at rest stops. "Dad, it smells like wet wood," Lily said as Marcus worked the key the county clerk had given him, a woman who'd processed his payment with the efficient sympathy of someone who'd watched too many broke people make bad bets on worse properties. "Old lumber and river rot," Marcus said, though the smell was more complex than that, Douglas fir gone to decay, creosote from decades of treatment, and organic matter that had been composting in sealed spaces for generations. The door to the main mill building opened onto a sorting floor where loggers had once delivered raw timber, massive chains and conveyors still hanging from ceiling beams like industrial sculpture. The main floor stretched into shadows that swallowed his flashlight beam after 40 feet. Equipment rose like monuments to obsolete industry, bandsaws the size of cars, their blades rusted into permanent stillness, planers that looked like torture devices from another era, and conveyor systems that traced paths through the space in patterns that spoke of efficiency refined over decades. Sawdust covered everything, compressed into layers that recorded the building's entire history like tree rings. "Can we live here?" Lily asked, her voice carrying that particular quality children develop when they know the answer but need their parent to acknowledge the reality anyway. "Not yet. Probably not ever. But it's ours." Marcus played his light over abandoned workstations, noting details that told stories of the building's last days. Time cards still hung in racks near what must have been the foreman's office, names and punch times marking shifts that ended when the mill closed in 1989. Hard hats sat on benches, their plastic shells brittle with age and UV exposure. Work gloves lay scattered across machinery, leather stiff with 30 years of temperature swings and moisture. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second building held the actual lumber processing equipment, kilns for drying freshly cut timber, treatment vats that had contained chemicals Marcus knew were banned now, and finishing equipment that transformed raw logs into dimensional lumber through processes that were equal parts craft and environmental violation. Marcus recognized some of it from his grandfather's stories, the old man who'd worked timber his whole life and died with a back ruined by decades of heavy lifting and lungs damaged by years of breathing sawdust. The third building, smallest of the three, contained offices and what appeared to be storage for finished products. Sample boards lined the walls, showing wood species and grades from decades past. Order books displayed customer names and quantities that told the story of a once thriving operation that had employed half the county. And on the wall in the largest office hung a photograph in a carved wooden frame, a man in his 60s, dressed in the style of the 1920s, standing before a massive log with one hand resting on a crosscut saw. The brass nameplate read, Elijah Riverside, founder and proprietor, 1872 to 1948. "Who's that?" Lily asked, pointing at the stern-faced man whose expression suggested the absolute confidence that came from building something monumental from nothing but vision and timber. "The person who started this place. Before my grandpa was even born." Marcus explored further, finding stairs to what appeared to be executive offices on a second floor built into the sorting building. The largest office belonged to Elijah Riverside himself, a desk made from what looked like a single slab of old-growth walnut that must have been 6 feet across, chairs crafted from bent oak that had survived better than anything else in the complex, and windows overlooking both the river and the mill yard where mountains of logs had once been stockpiled. The desk still held evidence of interrupted business. A ledger lay open to pages filled with precise handwriting. An ink blotter held the ghost imprint of words Marcus couldn't decipher. And on the wall behind the desk hung an oil portrait of the same man from the photograph, older here, perhaps in his 70s, painted with the gravity that timber barons commissioned to ensure their empires would be remembered. "Dad, I'm thirsty," Lily said, tugging at his work shirt. Marcus checked his phone, surprised to see they'd been inside for over 3 hours. The September afternoon was fading toward evening, and he needed to figure out where they'd sleep tonight since the trailer was already padlocked and the lumber mill was legally uninhabitable and probably structurally unsound. "Yeah, sweetheart. Let's go find something to drink." As he turned toward the stairs, his boot caught on something and he stumbled, catching himself against the desk. Looking down, he saw a section of floorboard that had come loose, revealing a cavity beneath. And in that cavity, barely visible in the failing light, was a metal box about the size of a toolbox, its surface engraved with images of trees and logging equipment. Marcus knelt and extracted it carefully, surprised by its substantial weight. The box was sealed with a combination lock, but the mechanism was so corroded from decades of moisture that it opened with firm pressure, revealing contents wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from the elements. Inside was a leather-bound journal, and tucked into its pages was a folded document that looked like survey maps and architectural drawings. The journal's first page bore a date, May 3, 1947, and an inscription in the same precise hand as the ledger, "To whoever discovers this, I am Elijah Riverside, founder and proprietor of these lumber operations. What you have found is merely the introduction to what remains concealed within these buildings and this land. The economic changes and resource depletion destroyed many timber fortunes, but I learned from my father's mistakes and kept my wealth close, hidden in ways that will require both determination and understanding to uncover. This property contains the accumulated profit of 75 years of operation, secured from taxation, creditors, and those who would claim what they did not earn. I leave this journal as proof and challenge. The maps enclosed will guide you to treasures, but only if you possess the wisdom to interpret them correctly. Many will own this property after my death, but few will understand what it truly holds. May you prove yourself worthy of the discovery." Elijah Riverside. Marcus read the passage 3 times, his pulse accelerating with each reading. A timber baron's hidden wealth, concealed within buildings and land everyone assumed was worthless and contaminated. The box held only this journal and the maps, but if Riverside was telling the truth, there were actual treasures, valuable assets hidden somewhere on this 23-acre property. He unfolded the maps, finding they showed the lumber mill complex in remarkable detail, every building, every room, every structural element documented with surveyor's precision. The land itself was mapped with equal care, showing the river, the tree lines, and various structures that no longer existed. Certain locations were marked with red ink, 10 of them total, each annotated with cryptic phrases and measurements. One notation read, "Where the first tree fell, the cornerstone remembers prosperity." Another said, "In the kiln's brick heart, beneath the primary chamber, heat preserved more than timber." A third indicated a location on the riverbank, where the logs were chained, "The anchor holds more than wood." The clues were maddeningly vague and tantalizingly specific in equal measure. "What is it?" Lily asked, peering at the journal with curiosity that hadn't yet been beaten down by their circumstances. Marcus looked at his daughter, at the shoes with cardboard covering the holes, at the jacket she'd worn for 2 years that was now too small but they couldn't afford to replace, at the trust in her eyes that said she still believed her father could fix things even when Marcus barely believed it himself. He thought about the $420 he'd just spent on condemned buildings, about the 2 weeks until homelessness became official, about the arithmetic of single fatherhood and economic collapse that never quite added up to survival. And he thought about Elijah Riverside, a man who'd built an empire on timber and logging, who'd survived economic depression by hiding wealth where others wouldn't think to look, who'd left a map for someone desperate or clever enough to follow. "I think," Marcus said slowly, voice barely above a whisper, "I just found a reason to believe things might actually work out for us." He returned the journal to the metal box and slipped it into his jacket, folded the maps carefully and put them in his back pocket, and led Lily back through the lumber mill toward daylight. The buildings felt different now, not abandoned but dormant, like something waiting to reveal secrets to someone who knew how to listen. Every shadow held possibility, every structural detail potential significance, every square foot of land a potential hiding place for a timber baron's fortune. They emerged into the parking lot as the sun touched the western hills, painting the Willamette River in shades of copper and gold. Marcus looked back at the lumber mill complex, at 3 buildings full of history and supposedly hidden wealth, at 23 acres of possibility against the darkening Oregon sky, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with terror in proportions that made his chest tight and his hands shake. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife, Sarah, asking when she could expect this month's support payment and reminding him that her attorney was prepared to file for full custody if he couldn't demonstrate stable housing. He'd been avoiding her calls for 5 weeks, had no answer that wouldn't sound like excuses or outright lies. But standing in front of property that allegedly contained a fortune, Marcus had something approaching a direction if not quite a solid plan. He texted back, "Working on something. We'll call soon." Lily climbed into the truck, buckling herself with the automatic efficiency of a child who'd learned independence and self-sufficiency earlier than childhood should require, and Marcus sat in the driver's seat with Riverside's maps spread across the steering wheel. The survey drawings showed every detail of the lumber mill's construction and the property's layout, and the red markings indicated locations throughout the complex and the land itself, each with its cryptic clue. One location referenced the sorting floor where they'd entered. Another indicated the main mill building's foundation. Several marked the kiln building. 2 indicated locations along the riverbank. One marked a location in what appeared to be forest at the eastern edge of the property. The clues suggested Riverside had hidden his wealth systematically, distributed throughout structures and landscape in ways that would require searching, thinking, understanding the timber industry's logic and the land's natural features. Marcus started the truck, knowing he needed to find them somewhere to sleep tonight, but his mind was already working through the puzzle. A timber baron's hidden fortune in condemned lumber mill buildings and overgrown land, protected by riddles written in logging industry language. It was insane. It was probably fantasy born of a dying man's delusions. It was exactly the kind of desperate gamble a broke father with a daughter to protect might be crazy enough to believe in because the alternative was admitting he'd spent his last money on nothing. As he pulled onto the county road, Marcus made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would solve Elijah Riverside's puzzle, find whatever the old timber baron had hidden, and turn their impossible situation into something resembling stability and security. The lumber mill had sold for almost nothing because everyone assumed it was worth exactly that. Contaminated land and dangerous buildings fit only for demolition. But Marcus knew better now. He had information nobody else had. Sometimes the most valuable things were the ones everyone else had stopped looking for, hidden in plain sight by someone who understood that true wealth wasn't always visible on the surface, that the real treasure was often buried where only the desperate or the determined would think to dig. The buildings receded in his rearview mirror, 3 structures of possibility against the darkening Oregon sky, and Marcus Hayes drove toward an uncertain night with a map to hidden treasure in his pocket and the weight of impossible hope settling in his chest like a seed waiting for the right conditions to either sprout or die. Marcus spent their first night in the lumber mill illegally, spreading sleeping bags on the cleanest section of the second-floor office. Lily curled against him while September wind whistled through broken windows and carried the smell of old timber and river damp. The buildings groaned around them, timber frames contracting in the cooling night, ancient equipment settling under weight it had carried since before the Great Depression. Every sound made Marcus question whether he'd crossed from desperation into genuine madness, but morning came anyway, pale light filtering through sawdust-covered windows, and Lily woke asking what was for breakfast with the resigned pragmatism of a child who'd learned that adults rarely had good answers anymore and that complaining only made things harder for everyone. They ate gas station breakfast sandwiches and drank water from bottles Marcus had filled at a rest stop bathroom, and he studied Riverside's maps while Lily explored the office with strict instructions not to touch anything sharp, unstable, or suspicious-looking, which was essentially everything in the entire complex. The first marked location referenced where the first tree fell. The cornerstone remembers prosperity. Marcus knew enough about lumber mill operations to understand that meant the main mill building's foundation, the original structure where Elijah Riverside had first begun processing timber into dimensional lumber. The cornerstone was massive, carved granite inscribed with the mill's founding date of 1873 and Riverside's name in letters that had weathered over 70 years of Oregon rain and wind. Marcus examined it carefully, running his hands over every surface, searching for anything that felt loose, deliberately modified, or out of place. The stone was solid, immovable as bedrock, and after an hour of increasingly desperate searching he found nothing except cold hands and the growing suspicion that he'd spent his last money chasing a dead man's fever dream. He was still searching, now examining the foundation stones around the cornerstone, when his phone rang with Sarah's name on the screen. Marcus almost didn't answer, but avoiding her had never made anything better, only postponed the collision he knew was inevitable and probably made it worse when it finally came. "Where are you?" Sarah's voice carried the particular edge she reserved for conversations about his failures, that tone that said she'd already decided he was lying before he even spoke. "I called your landlord. He says you moved out 6 days ago without notice and without a forwarding address. We're fine. I found a place to stay." "What place?" "Marcus, you're 7 months behind on support, you haven't had steady work since May, and now you've moved without telling me where my daughter is sleeping at night?" Her voice shifted, anger giving way to something that might have been actual fear or might have been a calculated emotional manipulation. He could never tell anymore. "I'm not trying to make your life harder. But you need to face reality. If you can't provide stable housing and basic care, maybe Lily should stay with me and James for a while until you get back on your feet." The words hit like a physical blow to the sternum. Sarah had remarried 10 months ago, moved into James's house with its 3-car garage and its school district ranked in the state's top 5. She could provide everything Marcus couldn't: stability, resources, a future that didn't depend on finding a dead timber baron's hidden fortune. And family courts favored stability above all else, favored mothers in most cases, favored anything that looked more secure than a broke father sleeping illegally in a condemned lumber mill with structural violations. "No," Marcus said, the word coming out harder and more forceful than he'd intended. "She stays with me. That's not negotiable. Then prove you can take care of her. Stable housing, reliable income, proper schooling enrollment. You have 1 week, Marcus. After that, I'm filing for emergency custody modification and you can explain to a judge why you're better equipped to parent than I am." The call ended, and Marcus sat among the sawdust and spider webs with 1 week to transform his life from desperate gamble into something that resembled responsible parenting. He could sell the lumber mill property immediately, probably get $5,000 or $6,000 for the land alone despite the condemned buildings and environmental concerns, use that to rent something acceptable and buy himself time to find work. But selling meant giving up on Riverside's fortune entirely, meant accepting that he'd spent his last $420 on nothing but false hope. He climbed back upstairs to find Lily standing at a window, looking down at the parking lot where a Range Rover had pulled in, expensive and conspicuously out of place against the lumber mill's industrial decay. A man in his 70s emerged, well-dressed in the casual way that spoke of inherited wealth rather than earned success, and stood examining the buildings with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. "Who's that?" Lily asked, her voice quiet and uncertain. "I don't know, sweetheart. Stay here and don't come downstairs unless I call for you." Marcus descended quickly, emerging from the mill building's entrance as the man finished his initial inspection. He looked up when Marcus appeared, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting to find someone here despite the no trespassing signs and condemned property warnings. "You must be Hayes," the man said, his voice carrying the particular confidence that came from never having worried about money. "I'm Thomas Riverside. Elijah was my grandfather." Marcus's mind raced, calculating implications, threats, and potential complications. "I bought this property legally. County tax auction, paid in full with proper documentation. I'm aware. I'm the one who stopped fighting the environmental liens and back taxes." Thomas moved closer, his eyes scanning the buildings with something that looked like complicated grief mixed with resentment. "My family's been trying to divest this property for 40 years. Tax burden astronomical, environmental liability terrifying, structural violations that would cost millions to address properly. But my father, Elijah's only son, he always insisted we keep it in the family. Said there were obligations, things that mattered, responsibilities we couldn't walk away from. He died 8 months ago, and I finally convinced my siblings to cut our losses and let the county take it. So what do you want from me? To know what you found." Thomas gestured at the buildings, at the windows Marcus had been examining earlier. "My grandfather was a brilliant businessman and a ruthlessly complicated man. Built a fortune during the timber boom, supposedly lost everything during the Depression, then somehow rebuilt his wealth through methods that were never entirely transparent or explained to the family. Stories passed down through generations about money hidden in the lumber mill, wealth secured against government seizure and creditor claims. But if any of it existed, we never found it. We searched these buildings exhaustively over the decades, hired treasure hunters and structural engineers, even brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment. Found absolutely nothing." Marcus kept his expression carefully neutral, revealing nothing. "It's just an old lumber mill. Broken equipment, rotted timber, and environmental contamination. But not only that." Thomas's expression hardened, showing steel beneath the polished exterior. "I can see it in your posture, the way you're standing, the way you're positioning yourself. You found something. And legally speaking, there's a very legitimate question about whether assets deliberately hidden by the original owner to avoid taxation or creditor claims belong to the property's new purchaser or to the original owner's legal heirs. I bought the buildings and the land and everything on or in them. That's how property sales work in this country. Unless the assets were concealed with fraudulent intent to avoid legal obligations, or hidden in ways that suggest they weren't part of the property's inherent value but rather temporarily stored here." Thomas pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness. "I have attorneys who specialize in estate disputes, treasure trove law, and property rights litigation. We can do this cooperatively and split whatever you've found in a reasonable manner, or we can do it through the courts while you try to explain to Child Protective Services why you're raising a child in a condemned building with structural violations and environmental contamination." The threat was crystal clear, and Marcus felt the familiar rage that came from being cornered by people with more resources, better lawyers, and the luxury of fighting legal battles that would bankrupt him within weeks. But beneath the rage was calculation, the survivor's arithmetic he'd learned through years of barely managing to stay afloat. "Your grandfather left a journal," Marcus said finally, making the strategic decision to reveal partial information. "Hidden in his office upstairs. Locations marked throughout the property where he supposedly stored valuables. I haven't found anything yet except the journal itself and some old maps." Thomas's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, showing hunger and excitement beneath the practiced neutrality. "Show me everything. Now." They climbed to the second-floor office, Lily watching warily from the corner as Marcus spread Riverside's maps on the desk. Thomas studied them with the intensity of someone seeing family mythology confirmed as fact, his finger tracing the red markings, reading the cryptic notations his grandfather had written over 70 years ago. "He actually did it," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. "The stubborn, secretive old bastard actually hid his fortune in this property." He looked up at Marcus with new calculation in his eyes. "Here's what I propose. We search together, work as partners, split whatever we find 60-40. I get the larger share because it was my grandfather's wealth originally, but you get enough to make this worth your considerable effort and substantial risk. 50-50 or I continue alone." "You don't have time to continue alone. Your ex-wife just gave you 1 week to prove stability, which you absolutely cannot do while living illegally in a condemned building searching for treasure that might not even exist. You need money immediately, and you need help navigating the complex legal issues around treasure trove claims and estate law." Thomas's expression softened fractionally, showing something that might have been genuine sympathy. "I'm not trying to rob you, Hayes. I'm offering genuine partnership when I could just as easily destroy you through legal channels, code enforcement complaints, and custody challenges." Marcus looked at his daughter, at the sleeping bags in the corner that constituted their current home, at the impossible situation he'd bought for $420. Thomas Riverside had resources, connections, legal expertise, could probably smooth over complications Marcus didn't even fully understand yet. But partnership also meant splitting whatever fortune existed, meant giving up control, meant trusting someone whose grandfather had been cunning enough to hide wealth for 70 years. 60-40 in my favor, Marcus said finally, making his counteroffer. "My property, my discovery, my risk of injury or legal liability." Thomas considered for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Agreed. But we start immediately. Every day that passes is a day closer to your custody hearing, your eviction deadline, and potential code enforcement actions." They worked through the remainder of the morning and into the afternoon, following Riverside's maps to the marked locations with increasing desperation. Marcus had been searching the cornerstone area all wrong, looking at the stone itself when the clue said the cornerstone remembers prosperity. Thomas suggested they examine the foundation's interior, and after moving several tons of debris and rotted equipment, they found a section of foundation wall that sounded hollow when struck. Using sledgehammers and crowbars with determination that bordered on reckless destruction of property, they broke through the granite blocks to reveal a cavity behind them. Inside was a sealed steel box roughly the size of a footlocker, its surface showing decades of rust but its integrity intact. When they finally pried it open, Marcus felt his breath catch in his chest. Inside were stacks of currency wrapped in oilcloth, bills from the 1920s through 1940s in denominations that made Marcus's hands shake. There were also gold coins, dozens of them, pre-1933 double eagles that gleamed despite decades in darkness. And beneath the currency and coins were bearer bonds, certificates that entitled whoever held them to claim their face value. "Jesus Christ," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He actually did it. The old bastard actually converted his wealth and hid it in the walls." They sat on the debris-covered floor counting and cataloging for over an hour. The currency alone, if collectible, was worth potentially $40,000 to $60,000. The gold coins added another 100,000 minimum. The bearer bonds, if still valid and redeemable, could be worth hundreds of thousands more, possibly over $1 million depending on the issuing institutions and whether they were still solvent. "Conservative estimate," Thomas said, doing calculations on his phone with shaking hands. "We're looking at $500,000 just from this first cash. Your 60% is $300,000. More than enough to satisfy your custody requirements and then some." Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time since Sarah had left, taking half his life with her. $300,000. More money than his grandfather had earned in 40 years of timber work. More than Marcus had made in his entire adult life. Enough to prove to any judge that he could provide for Lily, enough to secure housing, enough to breathe for the first time in years. But even as relief flooded through him, even as Thomas was already making phone calls to authentication experts and numismatic specialists, Marcus noticed something that Thomas had overlooked in his excitement. Tucked beneath the bearer bonds were documents, ledgers with Elijah Riverside's precise handwriting, and when Marcus examined them more carefully, his stomach turned with a sickening realization. The ledgers documented systematic wage theft on a massive scale. Workers paid half of what they'd earned, hours deliberately shaved from time cards, injury compensation denied through fraudulent claims of employee negligence, company store prices inflated to keep workers perpetually in debt. Decades of exploitation in meticulous detail, showing exactly how Elijah Riverside had accumulated the fortune they'd just found. "What is it?" Thomas asked, seeing Marcus's expression change from elation to something darker. Marcus showed him the ledgers without speaking, watching Thomas's face shift from curiosity to confusion to something that might have been shame or might have been defensive anger. They sat in the debris-filled foundation cavity surrounded by found treasure and documented theft, and the weight of what they'd discovered felt suddenly much heavier than the gold and currency. "We can destroy these," Thomas said after a long silence, his voice tight. "The workers are all dead. Their families have moved on decades ago. Nobody benefits from reopening wounds from 70 years in the past." But Marcus was thinking about his own grandfather, the man who'd worked timber his whole life and died broke despite decades of backbreaking labor, whose employer had probably kept ledgers exactly like these documenting systematic theft. About the workers whose names filled these pages, whose stolen wages had bought the gold coins and bearer bonds they'd been so eager to claim as their own. "Your grandfather left something else," Marcus said, pulling out Riverside's journal and opening it to a page he'd noticed earlier but hadn't fully processed until now. An entry from April 1947, year before he died. Thomas read aloud, his voice growing quieter as he processed the words, "To whoever finds my fortune, know that it was built on the labor of men I underpaid, the injuries I ignored, the families I kept in perpetual debt through company store manipulation. I tell myself that business required such practices, that survival in a competitive industry demanded ruthlessness and exploitation. But at the end of my life, staring at my own mortality, I wonder if wealth earned through the suffering of others can ever truly be enjoyed, or if it poisons everything and everyone it touches. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is yours and yours alone. Use it wisely or use it poorly, but know that you cannot claim innocence about its source once you have read this confession." They sat in heavy silence, the ledgers spread between them like accusations written in precise handwriting, and Marcus understood with absolute clarity that Elijah Riverside had left more than hidden treasure. He'd left a test, a moral challenge, a question about whether someone desperate enough to search for hidden wealth was honest enough to acknowledge where that wealth had come from and what it had cost. "We still need the money," Thomas said finally, his voice defensive. "My grandfather's sins don't change the fact that you need to prove you can house your daughter properly, and I'd frankly like to recover something from a property that's been nothing but a financial drain on my family for 40 years. "But we'd know," Marcus said quietly. "Every single time we spent any of it, every purchase we made, every bill we paid, we'd know it came from stolen wages and deliberate exploitation. Every fortune in history comes from somewhere uncomfortable if you look hard enough and dig deep enough. At least we're being honest about acknowledging it." Marcus looked up at the ceiling, imagining Lily in the office above them, trusting her father to make decisions that would shape her entire future and define what kind of person she would become. Dawn had fully broken now, light streaming through the gaps in the foundation, and in a few hours the county code enforcement would make their rounds and Sarah would be calling her attorney to file custody modification paperwork. "There are 9 more caches," Marcus said, standing slowly and wiping sawdust and rust from his hands. Your grandfather's maps show all of them clearly. But one of them, marked on the eastern edge of the property in the forest, has a notation I didn't understand until just now. He pulled out the maps, pointing to a location marked with a slightly different symbol than the others. It says, "Where truth waits beneath the oldest timber, the final choice reveals the measure of a man." I think he left something else out there, something that explains why he documented his own systematic exploitation instead of simply destroying all the evidence. They spent the next 2 hours searching for and finding 3 more caches, working with desperate intensity as the September sun climbed higher. The second cache was hidden beneath the kiln building's brick floor, exactly as the cryptic clue had suggested, containing more gold coins and what appeared to be stock certificates from timber companies that had long since been absorbed into larger corporations. The third cache was embedded in the riverbank, protected by a watertight steel cylinder anchored exactly where the maps indicated logs had once been chained while awaiting processing. Inside were more bearer bonds and a collection of old currency that might be worth even more than the first cache depending on its condition and collectability. The fourth cache nearly killed them both. It was located in the basement of the sorting building, a space Marcus hadn't even known existed until Thomas pointed out a trapdoor hidden beneath decades of accumulated sawdust and debris. The basement was partially flooded with groundwater that smelled of chemicals and organic decay, and Marcus had to wade through it in darkness while Thomas held a flashlight from the stairs above, both of them acutely aware that the entire building could collapse at any moment. The cache was in a waterproof safe embedded in the concrete foundation wall, and getting it open required bolt cutters, a sledgehammer, and a level of reckless determination that felt like controlled insanity. Inside were more stacks of currency, bearer bonds, and documents that appeared to be property deeds and mineral rights certificates for land throughout Oregon and Washington. By early afternoon they'd found 5 of the 10 caches, and Thomas's running calculations had reached astronomical numbers that seemed impossible to believe. Conservative estimates put the total value at over $2 million, possibly $3 million or more depending on authentication, market conditions, and whether various bonds and certificates were still valid and redeemable. Marcus's 60% would be well over $1 million. More money than his grandfather, father, and Marcus himself combined had earned in 3 entire lifetimes of hard labor. But as they hauled the 5th container up from the flooded basement, both men exhausted, soaked with contaminated water, and covered in decades of accumulated filth, Thomas noticed what Marcus had been dreading. More ledgers, more documentation, more evidence of systematic exploitation that went even deeper than the first set. These ledgers showed not just wage theft but deliberate safety violations to save costs. Equipment maintenance deferred despite knowing it was dangerous. Safety complaints ignored or actively suppressed. Workers injured or killed in accidents that could have been prevented, their families paid minimal settlements under threat of being fired and blacklisted from the industry entirely. "My God," Thomas said, reading through the documents with growing horror. He documented everything. Every corner he cut, every safety violation he ignored, every worker he sacrificed for profit margins. Why would he keep such detailed records of his own crimes? Marcus was thinking about the final cache, the one marked differently on the map, the one in the forest with the notation about truth and choice and the measure of a man. Because he wanted whoever found his fortune to understand exactly what it cost. Not just the workers who were stolen from, but the people who were injured or killed because he valued money more than human life. The sun was starting to descend toward the western hills when they finally made their way to the eastern edge of the property, following the maps through overgrown forest that hadn't been logged in over 70 years. The trees here were second-growth Douglas fir, but some of them were massive, 70 years of unrestricted growth having created a small patch of forest that looked almost primeval. The map indicated a location beneath the oldest timber, and after searching for nearly an hour they found it, a Douglas fir that was clearly older than the others, probably left standing during the original logging operations as a seed tree. At its base, partially buried and covered with decades of moss and forest debris, was a stone marker with Elijah Riverside's name carved into it. Beneath the stone marker, buried 3 feet down, they found not treasure but a wooden chest containing documents. And when Marcus opened it, he understood with perfect clarity what Elijah Riverside had intended as his final message. The chest contained complete documentation of the exploitation. Not just ledgers but photographs of dangerous working conditions, sworn statements from workers about the exploitation they'd suffered, medical records of injuries that had been covered up or minimized, and death certificates of workers who'd been killed in preventable accidents. It also contained a detailed accounting of how much wealth Riverside had accumulated through each specific form of exploitation, calculating that approximately 60% of his total fortune had been built not through legitimate business practices but through systematic wage theft and cost-cutting that put workers in danger. And at the bottom of the chest, in an envelope sealed with wax that had somehow survived 7 decades, was a final letter in Riverside's increasingly shaky handwriting. To whoever has followed my maps this far, you have found my fortune and you have found the truth about how it was built. The chest before you contains evidence that could bring shame to my family name and potentially legal claims against my estate even now, generations after my death. I could have destroyed all of this evidence. I should have destroyed it. Any rational person would have erased every trace of their sins before dying. But I find I cannot die with this weight on my conscience without at least creating the possibility that it might be addressed, that the people I harmed might somehow receive acknowledgement if not justice. The fortune is yours if you want it. But so is this choice. You can take the money and destroy this evidence, enjoying wealth without the burden of its origins. Or you can do something I lacked the courage to do while living, acknowledge the exploitation openly, seek out the descendants of those I harmed, and use the fortune to make whatever restitution is possible. I have calculated that approximately 60% of my total wealth was accumulated through wage theft, safety violations, and company store manipulation. If you have the integrity I lacked, you will recognize that 60% belongs not to you but to the families of those I exploited. The choice will define you more surely than the wealth ever could. And you will have to live with that choice for the rest of your life, just as I died with mine. Elijah Riverside, April 15, 1947. Marcus read the letter twice, then handed it to Thomas, who read it with an expression that moved from confusion to something that might have been grief or might have been relief that his grandfather had at least possessed enough conscience to feel guilt about his actions. They sat in the forest as afternoon shadows lengthened around them, surrounded by documentation of systematic exploitation and a dead man's confession, and understood that Elijah Riverside had left them not just with treasure but with the same moral choice that had apparently haunted him at the end of his life. "What do you want to do?" Thomas asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang with Sarah's number. He answered, already knowing this wouldn't be good news. "Child Services called me," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Anonymous tip that you're living in a condemned building with Lily. They're investigating. I've already called my attorney. I'm coming to get her right now, today, and you can explain to a judge why you should ever be allowed unsupervised custody again." "Sarah, wait, no more waiting. I'll be at whatever address they gave me in 2 hours with James and my attorney. You can hand her over voluntarily or we can involve law enforcement. Your choice." She hung up. Marcus sat heavily on the forest floor, the weight of the past week finally crushing down completely. Thomas stood nearby, clearly uncertain what to say to a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. "How much is my share worth?" Marcus asked finally, his voice hollow. "Absolute best case estimate, if we authenticated everything and found buyers for all of it." Thomas pulled out his phone, consulting the calculations he'd been updating all day. "Based on what we've found in 5 caches, and projecting similar values for the remaining 5, we're looking at around $2.5 million total. Your 60% is $1.5 million. More than enough to prove financial stability and secure custody. Enough to never worry about money again. And if we tried to find the descendants of the workers? Make actual restitution for what your grandfather stole?" Thomas was quiet for a very long moment, looking at the documentation spread around them. Riverside's own calculations say 60% of his fortune was built through exploitation. 60% of $2.5 million is $1.5 million. The exact amount that would be your share. He looked at Marcus with something like understanding. "If we did full restitution as he calculated it, you'd get essentially nothing. Everything you found would go to worker descendants, But we'd know we did the right thing. You'd also lose custody of your daughter because you'd have no money to prove stability. Marcus looked up at the Douglas fir towering above them, at a tree that had witnessed 100 years of forest growth, that had been standing when Elijah Riverside had made the choice to exploit workers for profit. He thought about Lily trusting him to make good decisions, about what kind of man he wanted to be, about whether keeping his daughter was worth building their future on stolen wages and dead workers' suffering. "There's got to be another option," Thomas said suddenly, his voice carrying new urgency. "We don't just keep the money or give it all away. We establish something. Use the wealth to create opportunities that serve the community and acknowledge what was done. Not direct restitution, which is mathematically impossible after 70 years, but something that honors the workers and creates opportunities for their descendants." "Like what?" "The lumber mill. We remediate it properly, restore the buildings, but don't sell it or develop it for profit. We turn it into something that provides good jobs and skills training. A woodworking cooperative maybe, or a vocational training center for timber trades. Something that generates value for working people rather than extracting it from them." Marcus considered this, the idea taking shape as the shadows grew longer. That would take most of the fortune just for environmental cleanup, structural repairs, and conversion. Most but not all. You'd keep enough to satisfy your immediate needs, prove to the court you're stable, secure proper housing, establish steady income as project manager. But the bulk would go toward creating something that actually benefits the community that was exploited. "And you'd agree to this? Give up your 40% for a community project?" Thomas looked around the forest, at the marker bearing his grandfather's name, at the chest full of evidence of systematic exploitation. "My family's been trying to escape this property for 40 years, trying to pretend it was just unfortunate business history. Maybe instead of running from it, we should run towards something better. Use Riverside's fortune, built on exploitation, to create something he never had the integrity to build, a legacy that actually supports workers rather than stealing from them." They spent the next 3 hours making frantic phone calls and establishing the basic framework. Thomas had connections to economic development agencies, environmental remediation specialists, and business attorneys who could fast-track the necessary legal structures. Marcus had nothing but desperation and a property full of contaminated buildings and tainted treasure. But together, working with increasing urgency as the deadline approached, they sketched something that might actually work: authenticate and liquidate all the found assets through proper legal channels. Use approximately 75% of the proceeds for comprehensive environmental remediation, structural restoration, and conversion to a worker-owned cooperative and vocational training center. Split the remaining 25% between them. Marcus's share would be approximately $90,000. Not the $1.5 million he'd briefly imagined. But enough to rent a proper house, pay Sarah everything he owed, establish a legitimate income stream as the project's manager, and prove to any family court judge that he could provide stable housing and steady employment. When Sarah arrived with James and her attorney, Marcus met them in the parking lot. Lily was with him, and Thomas stood nearby with a briefcase absolutely stuffed with documentation they'd prepared in desperate haste. "We're not negotiating here," Sarah's attorney began with predictable aggression, but Marcus held up his hand. "I'm not fighting you. You're absolutely right that I haven't been able to provide adequate stability. But that's changed as of today." He handed Sarah a folder containing bank documentation showing an immediate deposit of $50,000 as an advance payment for project management services, a signed lease for a house in town with first and last month's rent already paid, and proof of enrollment for Lily at the local school starting Monday morning. Sarah examined the papers with obvious suspicion, looking for the trap or the scam. "Where did this money come from?" "Marcus, if you're involved in something illegal, nothing illegal. I found historically significant assets on the property. Currency and bonds from the 1920s through 1940s, gold coins, various financial instruments that have substantial collector and historical value. Authenticated everything with experts, sold through legitimate auction houses with full legal documentation." Marcus gestured to Thomas. "This is Thomas Riverside. His grandfather built this lumber mill and left assets hidden throughout the property. We've been working with attorneys to properly authenticate everything and establish clear legal ownership. James spoke for the first time, his corporate attorney voice carefully assessing the situation. And the lumber mill itself? It's still condemned property with environmental violations. We're in the process of establishing it as a worker-owned cooperative and vocational training center. Full environmental remediation, structural restoration, conversion to a facility that provides job training in timber trades and woodworking skills. I'm the project manager, which provides steady employment and legitimate income. Sarah's attorney examined all the documentation with obvious frustration, clearly searching for problems but finding none. The bank statements were completely legitimate, the lease was proper and fully executed, the employment contract was legally binding, and the authentication documents from numismatic experts and historical appraisers were unimpeachable. "Can I talk to you alone?" Sarah asked Marcus, her voice having lost some of its confrontational edge. They walked toward the river that ran behind the property, far enough from the others to have privacy. Sarah stood looking at the water for a long moment before speaking, and when she did her voice was quieter, less angry, almost vulnerable. "I didn't want to take her from you. I wanted you to succeed. To be the father you should be, the father I know you can be when you're not drowning. I know. And I understand why you were scared. I was scared too. I am scared. What really happened? A week ago you had literally nothing. Now you have money and a house and employment." Marcus considered how much truth to share, then decided she deserved honesty. "I bought condemned property with my last $400 because I was completely desperate. Found out the original owner had hidden valuable assets throughout the buildings and land. Enough that when we authenticated and sold everything properly, I got a share. Not enough to be wealthy, but enough to be stable and provide properly for Lily. And you're really using most of it for this cooperative thing? This training center? Most of it belongs to other people. The workers whose wages were stolen, whose safety was ignored, who died in preventable accidents because the owner valued profit over human life. The money came from that exploitation. Thomas and I decided that using it to create good jobs and training opportunities was better than just keeping it for ourselves." Sarah studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the desperate edge that had characterized him for over a year. "You look different. Like you can breathe without drowning. Like you're not just surviving anymore." "I can breathe. First time in a long time. And I know I can't promise I'll never struggle again. But I can promise I'll keep fighting to be the father Lily deserves." She nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I'm not withdrawing the custody petition entirely. But I'm not pursuing emergency modification. We'll work out a proper shared schedule, make sure Lily has real stability with both of us. But Marcus, if you slip back into crisis, if you can't maintain this stability. I understand. And thank you for giving me this chance." The remediation and conversion took longer than anyone projected and cost substantially more than initial budgets allowed. Environmental cleanup alone consumed 8 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars as they discovered contamination that ran deeper and more extensive than any assessment had predicted. Structural repairs required essentially rebuilding large sections of all 3 buildings from the foundation up. Historic preservation requirements added layers of complexity and expense that threatened to derail the entire project multiple times. But the work was real, paid honest wages to local workers, and gave Marcus a sense of purpose that went far beyond simple economic survival. Thomas became not just a partner but something approaching a genuine friend, his business expertise and family connections complementing Marcus's growing knowledge of project management and community development. They established a board for what they named the Riverside Workers Legacy Cooperative, deliberately including descendants of workers whose names appeared in Elijah Riverside's exploitation ledgers. The mission was straightforward and uncompromising: acknowledge the exploitation that had built the original fortune. Use that fortune to remediate the environmental damage the lumber mill had caused. create a worker-owned cooperative that provided good jobs, skills training, and opportunities for people who needed them, structured in ways that made exploitation impossible. The remaining assets from the 9 caches they eventually found sold for more than Thomas's most optimistic estimates. Bearer bonds proved more valuable than anticipated. Gold coins in exceptional condition fetched premium prices from collectors. Historic currency attracted intense interest from museums and serious collectors willing to pay extraordinary amounts. After all costs were paid, after the cooperative was fully established and endowed, after the buildings were restored and programs launched, the total exceeded $3 million. Lily turned 9 during the first year of construction, celebrated her birthday in buildings still under restoration, her friends exploring the job site while wearing safety equipment and learning about the project's mission. Marcus watched his daughter navigate the lumber mill with growing confidence, explaining its history and transformation to her classmates with the ease of someone who understood that complicated truths were more valuable than simple myths. The grand opening happened on a September afternoon 2 years after Marcus had bought the property for $420. Over 300 people attended, including descendants of workers Elijah Riverside had exploited, community members who'd watched the buildings decay for decades, government officials who'd tried to condemn them, and workers who would staff the newly opened cooperative. Marcus stood in the renovated main mill building, surrounded by restored equipment that was now used for training rather than profit maximization, by spaces that would house the cooperative's operations and community workshops and educational programming. He felt the particular satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful out of ruins and desperation. Thomas found him standing near the memorial wall, where visitors were reading Elijah Riverside's confession letter and examining the exploitation documentation they'd chosen to display rather than destroy. Strange thing, making a monument to your grandfather's crimes. Better than hiding them, Marcus said quietly. He left us that choice. We made it. You made it. I just had the sense to follow your lead instead of fighting you. You could have fought me in court. Could have tied everything up in litigation while I lost custody and any chance at the money. Thomas looked at his grandfather's portrait, now displayed with comprehensive context about both his business success and his systematic exploitation of workers. I spent my entire life proud of being a Riverside, proud of coming from timber wealth. Now I don't know what to be proud of. Be proud that you didn't hide the truth. That you helped build this. Your grandfather created wealth through exploitation. We're using that wealth to create opportunity without exploitation. That's not redemption for him, but it's something meaningful for us and for this community. The Riverside Workers Legacy Cooperative opened with 23 full-time positions, 3 apprenticeship programs in traditional timber trades, and educational programming that served the entire county. The worker ownership structure meant profits were shared among employees rather than extracted by distant owners. Revenue from operations and the endowment covered all costs while providing wages substantially above regional averages. Marcus took the position of executive director, drawing a salary that allowed him to rent and eventually buy a house, pay all his obligations to Sarah, and provide stability for Lily. The work was demanding, requiring constant coordination between the cooperative's operations, the training programs, and the ongoing building maintenance. But it was work that meant something beyond personal survival, contribution to something that would outlast him. Sarah's marriage to James ended after 4 years, amicable enough that she moved to a house nearby. The custody arrangement evolved into genuine co-parenting rather than court-mandated obligation. She attended cooperative events regularly, bringing James sometimes even after their divorce, supporting what Marcus had built even as she built her own separate life. On the 2-year anniversary of the cooperative's opening, Marcus stood in the forest where he'd found Elijah Riverside's final confession. The space had been preserved as part of the property, the old Douglas fir still standing, the stone marker still visible. He'd brought Lily to show her where everything had changed. Great-grandpa would have liked this, Lily said, looking up at the massive tree. He always said timber bosses were thieves, but he'd appreciate someone trying to fix it. Your great-great-grandfather worked in lumber mills? Yeah. Grandpa told me stories. Great-great-grandpa worked for some mill that paid him almost nothing and then fired him when he got hurt on the job. He died pretty young from the injuries. Marcus felt his breath catch. He returned to the cooperative and searched through the exploitation ledgers, running his finger down lists of names until he found it. Samuel Hayes, hired 1932, terminated 1938 due to injury, wages owed, $4,284, amount paid, $2,156, stolen, $2,128. Injury compensation denied. His own great-grandfather. His own family's suffering documented in Elijah Riverside's meticulous records. The fortune Marcus had found had been built partly on his own great-grandfather's stolen wages and denied injury compensation. He sat in the memorial room surrounded by documentation of systematic exploitation, understanding with perfect clarity why the moral choice had felt so urgent, so personal. This wasn't abstract history or distant injustice. This was his family's pain, his great-grandfather's suffering, the reason his grandfather had died broke despite a lifetime of hard work. Lily found him there, recognized the ledger entry, understood immediately what it meant without Marcus having to explain. So he gave back great-great-grandpa's money to help other people, Lily said thoughtfully. Some of it. Not enough. Never enough. But we tried. That's what matters though, right? That you tried to make it right even when it was hard? Even when keeping the money would have been easier? Marcus pulled his daughter close, understanding that this was the legacy that truly mattered, not the money he'd found or the buildings he'd restored, but the lesson about integrity and difficult choices in doing what was right even when it cost you something precious. 5 years after buying the lumber mill, Marcus received letters from descendants of dozens of workers whose names appeared in Riverside's exploitation ledgers. They'd learned about the cooperative, visited the memorial, wanted to express gratitude that someone had finally acknowledged what had been done to their families and used the stolen wealth to create something meaningful. The letters included photographs of the workers, images Marcus carefully added to the memorial wall that now filled an entire building. The wall documented not just the exploitation but the transformation, showing both the theft and the response, acknowledging that perfect justice was impossible but partial justice through acknowledgement and restitution was worth pursuing. Thomas stood with Marcus at the wall's expansion ceremony, both men older now, the years of managing the cooperative having left their marks in gray hair and permanent exhaustion lines. I think about my grandfather's final letter constantly. That line about the choice defining us more surely than the wealth ever could. He was right, Marcus said simply. The fortune's gone now, spent on this place and these programs. But what remains is the choice we made, and the fact that we chose honesty over expedience, restitution over profit. The cooperative continued operating sustainably, not dramatically profitable but stable and growing, serving the community and providing opportunities that honored the workers who'd been exploited to create the original wealth. Marcus turned 40 managing the complex he'd owned for 8 years, surrounded by people who'd built entire careers in spaces he'd helped restore. On the 10th anniversary of his $420 purchase, Marcus stood at the river overlook they'd built on the property, watching the Willamette flow past. Lily was finishing college with plans to return and eventually take over cooperative management, having grown up understanding that the most important work is often the slowest, the most difficult, the least immediately profitable. The lumber mill buildings stood behind him, 3 structures of restored timber and renewed purpose against the morning sky. The fortune he'd found was long gone, spent on remediation and programming and wages and the constant cost of maintaining both buildings and integrity. But what remained was infinitely more valuable: structure, community, honest legacy built not on what he'd inherited but on what he'd chosen to do with that inheritance. Marcus understood what he'd really bought for $420, not treasure or salvation but the opportunity to make a choice that would define not just him but everyone who came after, the chance to build something honest from ruins and exploitation, to prove that legacy isn't what you find buried in walls but what you choose to build once you understand where the wealth came from and what it cost to accumulate. The river flowed toward the Pacific, patient and eternal, and Marcus Hayes stood watching it flow, holding the weight his great-grandfather had carried, understanding that sometimes the most valuable inheritance is the truth about the past and the courage to build something better from it, teaching each generation that the true measure of wealth isn't what you possess but what you're willing to sacrifice to make things right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.